Karoline Leavitt thought she had come prepared to that press briefing. She had her talking points, had rehearsed anticipated questions, and could usually control the press corps. But Jasmine Crockett's presence made her uncomfortable. As a congresswoman who rarely attended press briefings, Crockett had come specifically today. And what Leavitt didn't know was that Crockett had been preparing for this moment for weeks. The White House press briefing room hummed with its usual controlled chaos on that Wednesday afternoon in late September. The cramped space, with its 49 blue velvet seats and iconic podium bearing the presidential seal, had witnessed countless political dramas over the decades. But today felt different. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt stood at the podium, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her navy blazer pressed to perfection. At 26, she was the youngest press secretary in history, and she had earned the position through a combination of media savvy, unwavering loyalty, and an ability to deflect the most hostile questions with practiced ease. She had her usual arsenal of preparation, talking points organized by topic, anticipated questions with pre-approved responses, and the kind of confidence that came from months of successfully managing the White House press corps. But in the third row, seated between a CNN correspondent and a reporter from the Hill, sat someone who made Leavitt feel slightly uneasy. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas rarely attended White House press briefings. As a member of Congress, she had her own ways of getting information from the administration, and the press briefing room wasn't typically where lawmakers did their oversight work. But today, she was here. And Leavitt couldn't shake the feeling that Crockett's presence wasn't coincidental. What Leavitt didn't know was that Crockett had been planning this moment for 3 weeks. It had started with a routine oversight request that had gone unanswered. Then, a series of misleading statements from the administration about immigration enforcement that Crockett's staff had fact-checked and found wanting. Finally, there had been last week's congressional hearing where administration officials had provided testimony that directly contradicted information Crockett had received from sources in the field. Crockett had tried the usual channels: written requests, formal inquiries, private meetings with administration officials. All had been stonewalled or deflected with the kind of bureaucratic non-answers that had become the administration's trademark. So she had decided to try a different approach. Leavitt called the briefing to order at 2 p.m. sharp. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we take questions, I want to address the President's upcoming trip to the border, where he'll be highlighting this administration's continued commitment to border security and immigration enforcement. She delivered the opening statement with practiced precision, hitting all the required talking points about successful deportation numbers, increased border patrol presence, and deterrent effects on illegal immigration. It was the kind of statement that had become routine, heavy on statistics, light on context, designed to project strength while avoiding specifics that could be challenged. For the first 20 minutes, the briefing proceeded exactly as Leavitt expected. Reporters asked predictable questions about the president's schedule, policy announcements, and reactions to congressional criticism. Leavitt deflected with skill, pivoting to preferred talking points and running out the clock on follow-up questions. But then, at 2:23 p.m., Crockett raised her hand. "Karoline," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I have a question about immigration enforcement numbers." Leavitt felt her stomach tighten slightly. Congressional oversight questions were different from press inquiries. They carried the weight of constitutional authority and were harder to dismiss. "Of course, Representative Crockett," Leavitt replied, her voice maintaining its professional tone while her mind raced through potential responses. "You mentioned successful deportation numbers in your opening," Crockett began, consulting a folder she had brought with her. "Can you be specific about how those numbers are calculated?" It seemed like a straightforward question, but Leavitt sensed there was more coming. "Representative, our deportation numbers reflect individuals removed from the United States through various enforcement mechanisms, including voluntary departures and formal removals." "I see," Crockett said, making a note. "And when you say various enforcement mechanisms, Are you including asylum seekers who voluntarily withdraw their applications to avoid prolonged detention? Leavitt paused. This was getting into territory that required more nuance than she typically provided in press briefings. Representative, our statistics reflect all individuals who exit the immigration system through enforcement actions. That's interesting, Crockett replied, because according to data I've received from ICE field offices, approximately 40% of your reported deportations are actually voluntary withdrawals of asylum applications, people who haven't been deported at all, but have simply given up on the legal process. The room had grown quieter. Other reporters were now paying closer attention, sensing that this wasn't typical briefing room theater. Leavitt felt the first prickle of concern. Representative, I'd have to look at the specific data you're referencing. I have it right here, Crockett said, holding up a document. This is ICE data from the past 6 months, broken down by enforcement category. Would you like me to read the specifics? Leavitt realized she was walking into territory where her usual deflection tactics wouldn't work. Crockett clearly had information that Leavitt hadn't been briefed on. Representative, I'd prefer to review any specific data claims outside of this briefing and provide you with a comprehensive response. That's fine, Crockett said with a slight smile. But since you're making public claims about deportation numbers, shouldn't the public understand how those numbers are actually calculated? She didn't wait for an answer. Let me ask a different question. Last week, in testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, ICE Director Morrison stated that the administration was prioritizing deportations of individuals with serious criminal convictions. Is that accurate? Leavitt nodded, feeling slightly more confident. Yes, this administration has consistently prioritized the removal of criminal aliens who pose a threat to public safety. Good, Crockett said. So when you report deportation numbers, what percentage involves individuals with serious criminal convictions versus individuals whose only violation is immigration status? The question hung in the air like a trap. Leavitt realized that any specific answer she gave could be fact-checked and potentially contradicted by the data Crockett clearly possessed. Representative, our enforcement priorities focus on public safety threats. That's not what I asked, Crockett interrupted politely but firmly. I asked for the percentage breakdown of deportations by criminal history. Surely the administration tracks this data if public safety is truly the priority. Leavitt felt sweat beginning to form under her blazer. Representative, I'd need to provide you with specific breakdowns outside of this briefing. Actually, Crockett said, consulting another document, I already have the data. According to ICE reports, only 23% of deportations in the past 6 months involved individuals with serious criminal convictions. The remaining 77% were individuals whose only violation was immigration status. The silence in the briefing room was deafening. So when the administration claims to be prioritizing criminals, Crockett continued, the actual data suggests you're primarily deporting people whose only crime was seeking a better life in America. Leavitt was now visibly uncomfortable. Representative, immigration law violations are serious offenses. Civil violations, Crockett corrected. Immigration status violations are civil matters, not criminal ones. And deporting people for civil violations while claiming to prioritize criminals is misleading the American public. Other reporters were now frantically taking notes, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. A member of Congress using the press briefing room to conduct real-time oversight with actual data. Leavitt tried to regain control. Representative, this administration's immigration enforcement has been highly effective. Has it? Crockett interrupted. Because according to Border Patrol data, unauthorized border crossings have actually increased 12% since this administration took office. If your enforcement strategy is so effective, why are the numbers going in the wrong direction? Leavitt felt like she was drowning. None of her prepared talking points addressed these specific statistical challenges. Representative, border security involves multiple factors. It does, Crockett agreed, which is why I'm confused about this administration's approach. You're spending billions on deportations that primarily target non-criminals while border crossings increase. From a resource allocation standpoint, that seems ineffective. She leaned forward slightly. Unless the goal isn't actually border security, but rather the appearance of being tough on immigration for political purposes. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Leavitt's voice was strained when she responded. Representative, this administration is committed to comprehensive immigration enforcement. Then why did the administration cut funding for immigration courts by 15%, while increasing deportation enforcement by 40%? Crockett asked. If you're serious about comprehensive enforcement, wouldn't you want faster court processing to resolve cases more efficiently? Leavitt had no answer for that. The budget numbers were public record, and the contradiction was obvious to anyone who examined the data. Representative, resource allocation decisions involve complex considerations. They do, Crockett said, but the pattern suggests that this administration prefers deportation theater to actual immigration solutions. She consulted her notes again. For example, funding for legal immigration processing has been cut by 25%, leading to longer wait times for legal immigrants, which incentivizes illegal border crossings. Simultaneously, you've increased funding for enforcement actions that primarily target people already in the United States legally seeking asylum. Crockett looked directly at Leavitt. How does that strategy serve either immigration control or public safety? Leavitt looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Representative, I'd need to examine the specific funding allocations you're referencing. They're in the public budget documents, Crockett said matter-of-factly. Which raises another question. If the press secretary hasn't reviewed the basic budget numbers for the policies she's promoting, how can the public trust the information coming from this podium? The room was completely silent now. Several reporters were looking back and forth between Crockett and Leavitt like they were watching a tennis match. Leavitt tried one more deflection. Representative, the administration's immigration policy is comprehensive and data-driven. Is it? Crockett pulled out another document. Because I have internal administration emails obtained through FOIA requests, showing that deportation numbers are being inflated by including voluntary departures, that criminal priority categories are being expanded to include minor infractions, and that public statements about border security are being crafted to create impressions that don't match operational reality. She looked up at Leavitt. Would you like me to read some of these emails? Or would you prefer to address the disconnect between public statements and internal documents? Leavitt was now visibly sweating. Representative, I'm not familiar with the specific documents you're referencing. That's concerning, Crockett said, because these emails include communications with the press office about how to present immigration statistics to maximize political impact while minimizing scrutiny. She smiled slightly. One email specifically discusses how to frame deportation numbers to sound impressive without inviting detailed analysis. The briefing room erupted in whispered conversations and frantic note-taking. Leavitt looked desperately around the room, as if searching for an escape route. Representative, I think there may be some misunderstanding about these documents. There's no misunderstanding, Crockett said firmly. The documents are clear. This administration has been deliberately misleading the public about immigration enforcement effectiveness while implementing policies that actually make the problems worse. She gathered her papers. The question is whether you're going to continue reading talking points that contradict your own internal data, or whether you're going to start providing accurate information to the American people. Leavitt's voice was barely audible. Representative, I'll need to review these materials and provide a comprehensive response. You'll need to do more than that, Crockett said, standing up. You'll need to explain to the American people why their government has been lying to them about immigration policy. As Crockett walked toward the exit, the briefing room remained in stunned silence. Leavitt stood at the podium, looking like someone who had been hit by a truck. Are there any other questions? She asked weakly, but her voice was drowned out by reporters shouting follow-up questions about the documents Crockett had referenced. The briefing ended in chaos, with Leavitt retreating from the podium without providing substantive answers to any of the questions that followed Crockett's presentation. Within hours, clips of the exchange were spreading across social media and news outlets. But the real impact wasn't in the viral videos. It was in the precedent Crockett had set. She had demonstrated that the press briefing room could be used for real oversight, that administration officials could be held accountable with facts and documents, and that the usual deflection tactics didn't work when someone came prepared with actual data. 3 days later, the administration quietly released revised immigration statistics that more accurately reflected the breakdown between criminal and civil deportations. A week after that, the press secretary position was restructured to require more comprehensive briefing materials and fact-checking protocols. But perhaps the most telling response came from a veteran White House correspondent who had covered 6 administrations. "In 30 years of covering press briefings," she wrote, "I've never seen anyone use the format as effectively as Representative Crockett did that day." She turned a propaganda platform into an accountability session, and she did it simply by coming prepared with facts. Crockett's approach became a model for other members of Congress. Within months, administration officials found themselves facing more detailed questioning, more factual challenges, and more demands for specific data to support public claims. The era of unchallenged talking points and deflective non-answers hadn't ended. But Crockett had shown that it didn't have to be accepted as inevitable. Because sometimes the most powerful tool in democracy isn't a bigger platform or a louder voice. Sometimes it's just showing up with the receipts and refusing to accept anything less than the truth. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you that accountability requires preparation and truth is more powerful than spin, make sure to subscribe for more stories of people who prove that democracy works best when someone is brave enough to ask the hard questions and demand real answers.